There's a moment in every diplomatic breakthrough when the cameras move on before the real story has even started, and this is exactly that moment, because while the world celebrates a memorandum that supposedly ended the war between Washington and Tehran, the one country that fought alongside the United States for 3.5 straight months is standing at the edge of that celebration with its arms crossed, refusing to clap. Israeli President Isaac Herzog went on American television this week and called his own government's objections legitimate, choosing his words with the precision of a man who knows exactly how much damage a single sentence can do to an alliance, and the phrase he settled on was that no agreement can hold if Tehran walks away from this process still holding too much leverage. That single word, leverage, is what I want you to carry through the next several minutes, because once you understand what Israel actually means by it, the entire fight over this deal stops looking like a disagreement about paperwork and starts looking like something considerably more dangerous. Officially, this story being sold to the public fits comfortably on a single headline. Israel is the cautious ally, the partner who fought hardest and therefore worries hardest that the peace will be squandered, the government whose skepticism grows out of decades of hard-earned security experience rather than anything more calculated. That version is comfortable precisely because it asks nothing uncomfortable of anyone watching, letting Washington look generous and Jerusalem look prudent at the same time. But comfortable narratives are rarely complete ones. And this particular story collapses the moment you notice that the same Israeli government raising the alarm about alien leverage is also the government refusing to be bound by the very agreement it claims is too weak, continuing airstrikes in Lebanon days after the framework was announced, defying its closest ally in public statements, and reportedly drawing scrutiny from American intelligence officials over alleged surveillance of the negotiators who wrote the deal to begin with. None of that fits neatly inside the story of a worried friend offering honest criticism from the sidelines. Something else is happening beneath the surface, and by the end of this analysis, I intend to show you precisely what that something is, using nothing but verified reporting from the past several days. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, you have to remember how we got here. Hostilities between Israel, the United States, and Iran broke out at the end of February this year, when surprise strikes targeting Iranian military and government sites resulted in the killing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself, an outcome that reshaped the entire conflict overnight and pushed Iran's leadership into the hands of his successor under conditions no one had time to prepare for. What followed was nearly 4 months of missile exchanges, a closure of the Strait of Hormuz that rattled global energy markets, and strikes reaching as far as Gulf states that had tried to stay out of the fight entirely. That is the backdrop against which this memorandum was signed, and it explains why nobody in the region is treating it as a tidy ending. Wars that end with a head of state killed in the opening days rarely produce neat closing chapters, and this one has not. Let me offer 3 competing explanations for why Israel is pushing this hard against an agreement its own closest ally just spent months negotiating, because the truth in this region rarely sits cleanly inside one explanation. It usually lives in the friction between several. The first explanation is the one being offered openly, and it deserves a fair hearing before I challenge it. Call this the theory of sincere alarm, the proposition that Israeli officials genuinely believe the emerging framework creates a structural trap, and there is real substance behind that fear. Reporting from the past month describes a deal that reopens the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping almost immediately, while pushing the far harder question of Iran's enrichment levels, its existing stockpile, and any verification mechanism into a separate, slower negotiating track with no guaranteed timeline. A senior Israeli official described the emerging arrangement bluntly as a bad deal precisely because of that ordering, warning that the easy part gets locked in now, while the difficult part, the part that would actually constrain Iran's nuclear ambitions, might simply never arrive on schedule, or arrive so diluted that it changes nothing of substance. Add to that the question of frozen Iranian assets sitting in banks abroad, since unlocking those funds would hand Tehran exactly the financial oxygen Jerusalem has spent years trying to cut off, and Israeli officials have made little secret of preferring continued economic pressure over any arrangement that lets the regime rebuild its reserves so soon after a war that was supposed to weaken it permanently. Analysts at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have separately described Iran's enrichment program as a calculated leverage tool rather than a fixed weapons program, noting Tehran appears willing to dilute or export its higher enriched material only in exchange for sanctions relief and protection from future attacks, which is precisely the kind of conditional bargaining position that worries Israeli planners far more than an outright refusal would. If you are sitting in Jerusalem watching sanctions relief and asset unfreezing accelerate on one track while inspections and enrichment limits sit on a separate track that nobody can promise will ever close, calling that leverage is not paranoia, it is arithmetic, and reasonable people can read that arithmetic the same way Herzog does. There is also a quieter piece of arithmetic working in Tehran's favor that strengthens this first theory even further. Iran's own government polling reported just days ago found that nearly 60% of Iranians say they can no longer manage financially, and roughly 70% want fundamental changes to how the country is governed. A regime facing that level of internal economic exhaustion has every incentive to accept whatever sanctions relief Washington offers as quickly as possible then slow-walk the harder nuclear concessions once the immediate financial pressure has eased. From Jerusalem's perspective, that is precisely the sequence to fear most, a regime that takes the relief now and negotiates the constraints later. Once its own desperation has already been converted into breathing room, it no longer needs to trade away. The second explanation inverts the entire premise, and it deserves equal weight. This theory argues that the public argument over the deal's substance functions largely as a performance aimed at two audiences that have surprisingly little to do with Iran's nuclear file. The first audience sits inside Israel itself, where elections loom this fall and where former Prime Minister Ehud Barak has already accused the sitting government of hubris and strategic blindness for dragging Washington into a war it then could not finish on its own terms, where opposition figure Yair Lapid has built an entire campaign message around the idea that this premier misjudged Washington's appetite for a long war and was ultimately outmaneuvered at the negotiating table, and where several hawkish coalition partners are openly demanding the government keep fighting in Lebanon no matter what gets signed abroad. Compounding that domestic Israeli picture is a parallel dynamic unfolding inside Washington's own politics, where the picture turns out to be just as divided as it is in Jerusalem. A recent survey of the Republican Party's most committed base found that roughly half wanted to see regime change pursued inside Iran, while only a quarter were satisfied with a negotiated settlement that simply ends the fighting. That split inside Trump's own coalition gives Israel a useful domestic American audience to play to as well, since hawkish voices in Washington provide exactly the kind of political cover Jerusalem needs whenever it pushes back against the administration's own diplomats in public. None of this domestic pressure exists in a vacuum either, since Netanyahu is simultaneously fighting a long-running corruption trial at home, one where judges have already shown little patience for requests to shorten proceedings, meaning every public stance he takes on Iran is also being read by Israeli voters and commentators through the lens of a leader fighting for his own political survival on multiple fronts at once. The second audience, the one that actually matters for shaping outcomes rather than just opinion, sits inside the negotiating room in Switzerland itself, where Israel's loud public objections function less as principled criticism and more as leverage of their own, a pressure campaign aimed at shaping terms that Jerusalem cannot directly veto but can still attempt to bend through sheer public insistence. Under this reading, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir's blunt declaration that Trump's agreement simply does not bind Israel is not a careless slip. It is the clearest possible statement of exactly what this theory predicts, that Israeli policy in Lebanon was never actually going to be governed by whatever Washington decided to sign. The third explanation is a synthesis. And once you line the evidence up side by side, it is the one I find most persuasive. Under this view, Israel is not forced to choose between sincere alarm and political theater because it is running both tracks simultaneously and quite deliberately. The leverage critique is genuine, and Israeli officials almost certainly believe it, but it is also useful since it provides Jerusalem a respectable, internationally defensible public language for a private objective that has very little to do with paperwork at all, which is preserving an independent military option that survives no matter what any American memorandum eventually states. The public argument about enrichment ceilings and sanctions sequencing buys time and shapes the technical negotiations still underway in Switzerland, while the private reality on the ground, troops remaining in southern Lebanon, continued strikes against Hezbollah positions, accelerated production of Arrow interceptor systems at home, and reported intelligence collection against the very American officials drafting the agreement, secures the actual prize. That prize is freedom of action that no signature in a Swiss resort town can ever take away. So, welcome back everyone. And I have to say, I hope you all had a nice break, because we are about to get into something that I think is one of the most misread geopolitical moments of the entire Iran war. What makes this synthesis theory more convincing than either explanation standing alone is that it does not require Israeli officials to be lying when they raise the leverage critique in public. They can believe every word of it and still be using that belief instrumentally, the same way any government uses a true argument to justify a policy that was already decided on separate grounds. Jerusalem does not need to manufacture a fear of Iranian leverage to make this strategy work. It only needs to amplify a fear that already exists, point it directly at the negotiating table in Switzerland, and let the resolving pressure do work that a blunt admission of distrust toward Washington never could. Now let me steelman the first theory properly, because it remains the explanation most people already accept, and it earns a careful hearing before we move past it. The surface facts support it cleanly enough. The reported sequencing genuinely does favor Tehran in the short term, with Hormuz reopening for 60 days of toll-free passage while the nuclear file sits unresolved on a slower track. And Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has himself publicly insisted his country will never surrender its enrichment rights, hardly a conciliatory opening position for the harder negotiations still ahead. The actor incentives line up as well, since no Israeli government, regardless of who pushes the analysis from theory 1 toward the deeper layer of evidence I now want to walk you through. Let me lay out that evidence in the order it actually happened, because once you see these events placed on a single timeline rather than scattered across a dozen unrelated headlines, the pattern becomes very difficult to miss. Beginning with June 15th, the day the preliminary framework first became public, Prime Minister Netanyahu stood before reporters and declined to criticize an agreement he openly admitted he had not yet fully seen, while simultaneously declaring that with an agreement or without one, Israel would continue acting to prevent Iran from ever reaching nuclear weapons status. That single sentence performs two functions at once, withholding direct criticism of Washington in public, while quietly announcing that Israeli policy was never actually contingent on whatever Washington chose to sign. Move forward into the same week, when Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich described the political pressure being applied to his government as unprecedented, explicitly framing continued Israeli military activity against Iranian-aligned targets as something that proceeds regardless of diplomatic developments unfolding elsewhere. Notice what that statement quietly assumes, namely that Israeli military operations and the American negotiating calendar are two separate processes that simply happen to overlap in time, rather than one process meant to govern the other. Then comes Vice President Vance's striking public rebuke of Israeli critics, telling them flatly that Trump remains their only ally left anywhere in the world. A statement that only makes sense if relations between Washington and Jerusalem had already deteriorated to a point where a sitting American vice president felt it necessary to remind an ally publicly who its friends actually still are. Governments that fully trust each other rarely require that particular reminder delivered through a press microphone in front of cameras. Layer on to that, the reporting that the United States Defense Intelligence Agency has elevated its counterintelligence concerns, specifically regarding alleged Israeli surveillance of the American negotiators who built this very deal, an allegation Israel's embassy in Washington has flatly denied in full. Whatever the eventual truth of that specific claim turns out to be, its mere presence inside serious American reporting tells you that trust between these two governments at the operational level where actual policy gets written has eroded badly enough that each side's own intelligence services are now treating the other as a subject of concern rather than simply a partner sharing a single table. Add to this the domestic Israeli reaction itself, which has been anything but unified celebration. Former Prime Minister Barak has publicly accused the current government of strategic failure, arguing that Iran emerged from this war stronger while Israel emerged weaker, language unusually harsh even by the standards of Israeli political rivalry. Opposition leader Lapid has framed the entire outcome as a referendum on Netanyahu's judgment heading into elections this fall. That domestic fracture matters here because it tells you the loud public posture toward Washington is doing real political work inside Israel itself, not merely work inside the negotiating room in Switzerland. And finally, look at what has actually happened on the ground in the days since the framework was first announced. Israeli airstrikes have continued inside southern Lebanon. Israeli officials have stated outright that troops will remain in territory they currently occupy for as long as they deem necessary, and the Israeli military's own chief has described the mission in the north as clear and unchanged regardless of any diplomatic timeline running in parallel. Iran's own state media has warned that if Israel does not withdraw, Tehran will treat the entire negotiating framework as meaningless and suspend talks altogether. The Strait of Hormuz, supposedly reopened under the agreement, was shut again by Iran's Revolutionary Guard, specifically in response to those continuing Israeli strikes, demonstrating in real time exactly how fragile the so-called resolution actually remains. 7 separate threads, 7 separate sources, one consistent story emerging from all of them. The loudest argument happening in public concerns leverage and enrichment ceilings. The quietest argument, the one nobody is quite supposed to notice, concerns who still gets to keep fighting once the cameras finally go home. Israel is not the only regional actor reading this sequencing with suspicion, which matters because it tells you the leverage critique is not simply an Israeli talking point invented for domestic consumption. Gulf states that absorbed missile strikes earlier in this war, including Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, have their own reasons to worry about a framework that reopens Iran's access to shipping revenue and frozen assets well before its missile and proxy networks face any binding restriction. Analysts following the Gulf diplomatic file have noted that several of these governments view the current sequencing as a temporary stabilization measure rather than a genuine resolution, one whose durability depends entirely on what happens during the technical negotiations still to come. That regional unease gives Israel's public position a degree of company it otherwise would not have, and it is worth remembering as you watch how the rest of the 60-day window unfolds. This brings us to the mechanism underneath all of it, the structural feature of this entire process that explains every contradiction we just walked through, and I want to name it with precision. Call it the sequencing gap, the deliberate separation between what gets resolved immediately and what gets postponed indefinitely. And notice that this gap actually operates on two distinct layers rather than one. On the diplomatic layer, the gap separates Hormuz, which reopens almost at once, from the nuclear file, which waits on a slower, less certain track. But on the strategic layer underneath that, the same gap separates what Washington can actually guarantee, which is a piece of paper signed in a Swiss resort town, from what only Israel itself can guarantee, which is its own continued freedom to act militarily whenever it judges that paper insufficient to protect its interests. Israel's public complaint about the first layer is genuine enough, but it also functions as nearly perfect cover for protecting the second layer, because no government wants to stand before its own electorate and openly admit that it does not trust its closest ally's signature enough to stop acting unilaterally. It is far easier and considerably more survivable politically during an election season to frame the entire posture as concern over Iranian leverage than to admit the deeper truth, which is that Israel never intended to let any American memorandum constrain its own military options in the first place. Benjer simply said the unsayable part out loud. Everyone else keeps repeating the sayable part instead, and the distance between those two statements is the real story unfolding this week, however the headlines choose to frame it. This is also why the Aero Interceptor program matters more than most coverage has acknowledged. Israeli defense officials have already promised to significantly accelerate production of that system with the newer Aero 4 variant recently tested. And that kind of long-horizon military investment only makes sense if Jerusalem is planning for a future in which it expects to face renewed missile threats from Iran, regardless of whatever this particular memorandum eventually says. You do not accelerate a multi-year interceptor production line to defend against a threat you genuinely believe a piece of diplomatic paper has already neutralized. You accelerate it because you believe the underlying threat survives the paperwork entirely, which is the sequencing gap, expressing itself not in rhetoric this time, but in actual defense budgets and procurement schedules that take years to unwind once set in motion. So where does this actually lead from here? I want to leave you with 3 specific falsifiable things to watch across the coming 60-day window, because a serious analysis should hand you predictions you can personally verify rather than impressions you simply have to take on faith. First, watch whether Israeli strikes inside Lebanon continue or visibly pause during the technical negotiation period now underway in Switzerland. If the sequencing gap theory holds, those strikes will continue largely undisturbed regardless of diplomatic progress, because they were never genuinely tied to the American negotiating calendar to begin with. A clear pause directly tied to specific negotiating milestones would meaningfully weaken this entire analysis, and I would update my view accordingly if that happens. Second, watch whether the nuclear track produces any binding enforcement or inspection mechanism before the Hormuz arrangement becomes fully permanent and unconditional. If Israel's public objection is sincere rather than largely strategic cover, expect to see active, visible Israeli diplomatic pressure specifically aimed at accelerating that enforcement mechanism, not merely rhetorical criticism issued after each new development breaks. Third, watch whether the reported American intelligence concerns about Israeli surveillance of the negotiating team escalate to a genuine, public diplomatic rupture or quietly vanish from coverage within a matter of weeks. A quiet disappearance would itself carry real meaning, because allies capable of bearing an espionage allegation without lasting consequence are operating on a fundamentally different level of trust than the one currently being projected through public statements and joint press conferences. What we are really watching here is not a disagreement over deal terms at all. It is a preview of how Israel intends to behave for the remainder of this decade, regardless of who occupies the White House or what eventually gets signed in any Swiss resort town. The leverage Israel claims to fear sitting in Iran's hands is real enough to fill headlines for weeks, but the leverage Israel insists on keeping for itself, the right to act first, alone, and without seeking anyone else's permission, is the leverage that will actually decide what happens next across this entire region. That is the real reason Israel is fighting so hard against this deal, not because the paperwork is weak, but because no paperwork was ever going to be strong enough to replace the one asset Israel has never once been willing to outsource to anyone, including the friend it just spent 3.5 months fighting alongside in Washington. Every ceasefire in this region eventually produces the same quiet question once the formal signing ceremonies end, which is whether the parties who fought actually believe the document they just signed, or whether they are simply buying time to prepare for the next round on terms more favorable to themselves. Israel's behavior over these past several days answers that question more clearly than any single press conference could. A government that trusted the paper would not need to keep flying sorties over Lebanon while the ink was still drying, would not need to accelerate a multi-year missile defense program built for threats the agreement supposedly just resolved, and would certainly not need to read the private communications of the ally who wrote the agreement in the first place. Watch the 60 days ahead closely, because what happens on the ground in Lebanon and inside the nuclear track in Switzerland